Hello and welcome to SAM Conversations. The big news of the day, November 3rd, is the US elections. The American voter would have to decide whether it will be a second term for the sitting president, Mr. Donald Trump, or whether the Democrat candidate and former vice president, Mr. Joe Biden, would be elected to the White House. Global attention is focused on this particular development within the United States because it has ramifications for the entire world in more ways than one. And to try and have a brief conversation about this, I have Tarun Basu with me. And what we will do is to try and unpack this to the extent that we can and look at the implications of this election and the outcome whenever it is decided, whether it will be by Tuesday night American time or it will be a contested election, we do not know. But there are four levels at which we thought we might try and understand this particular election. One is, of course, what does it mean for the United States? The second is, what does it mean for the world? And here I am really looking at the major powers, that is the relationship between the United States, China, United States, Russia, United States, India, and so on. And the other two areas are really, what does it mean for South Asia as a region? What does it mean for the Indian diaspora in the United States? So that will be the brief frame. And this is a subject that we are going to revisit in all likelihood. So let me put my head on the block and say that when we look at this election, irrespective of who is going to emerge, whether it is Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, I think there are two strands that are very clear as far as I can see. One is that for the United States itself, when we look at this election, the primary interlocutor is the American citizen. And what we are seeing is a very polarized society. It was there in a latent manner even before Mr. Donald Trump assumed office. But in the last 4 years, this has been aggravated in more ways than one. And now you see that the political discourse of America is America first. And when he talks about America, it is white America. And there is an undertone, I would say, of the other in America, whether it is the Black African American or the brown American, the Hispanic American. And I think this is the kind of polarization that has taken place. If Mr. Biden does come to the White House, perhaps there would be an attempt to repair this damage. If Mr. Trump continues, in all likelihood, we will see more of the same because his voter base would expect more concessions, more policies that would take forward what he sees as the America first, which is white America first agenda. But this is a wait and watch as far as the United States is concerned. The second strand where I expect some continuity, oddly enough, is the relationship between the United States and the major powers. And here I'm identifying China, Russia, and India. And my brief take on this is that in all likelihood, there would be an essential continuity, even if Mr. Biden were to come to the White House, but there would be a change of form, meaning how would he deal with China, a Biden presidency? How would he deal with a Moscow? And how would he deal with a New Delhi? Again, my own take or assessment is that there is an essential continuity, but the form in which this would be pursued would perhaps be altered to a certain extent. But let me stop here and turn this over to Tarun, and perhaps Tarun could share his thoughts about US-India and the Indian diaspora, how that is likely to be affected and how relevant is it in the US election. Tarun, all yours.
Thank you, Uday. I'm glad we are having this conversation barely, I think, less than 24 hours before the people go to the polls, November 3 in the United States. As we speak, Biden has a clear lead in all the polls, especially Real Clear Politics gives him an 8-point lead, and so do others as well. But yet people are not ready to write off President Trump. And there is this segment of what they call either underrepresented or undecided voters who can still swing things at the last moment. Although analysts say that it's unlikely to happen that way, and all the so-called underrepresented and voters who were not part of or off the radar of previous polls have been factored in this time in all the polls things. Now, as far as Indian ties with India are concerned, I mean, one thing that the officials on both sides say, especially from the United States, that India is going to be a constant factor in the relationship, irrespective of which party wins. And I think some significant statements have been made by senior US officials who visited India as late as last week, when India and the US had the 2+2 dialogue, where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, while speaking to the Atlantic Council just before he came to Delhi, talked about the Indian relationship as the most consequential partnership of the US in this century. In fact, before that, the Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun, who had visited India in preparing for this dialogue, had also made a significant remark where he talked about that India is going to be a constant factor in this relationship, irrespective of the political shifts in power. And he said, whether politics might change in Washington, but the India-US relationship is only going to grow. And this is the lasting legacy of this administration. So it's I think interesting to note that even as the Washington was preparing for the polls, two of their most senior officials found time to be in Delhi and to reassure India that even if the administration changes in Washington, the relationship is unlikely to change. This is the one reassuring element of this relationship and the dialogue that was conducted here. The other factor, which is a very unusual factor in these election, is the unusual emphasis on the Indian American community. The Indian American community today is about 4.2 million, which is a little over 1% of the American population. Their registered voters are about 1.9 million, which is a little less than 1% of the American population. Yet, in spite of being the small number, they were actively wooed by both the Republicans as well as the Democrats. And not only, in the usual campaign focus, but also in various languages, various Indian languages, from Punjabi to Bengali to Hindi. There were memes, there were videos, there were campaign slogans, all kinds. So as far as the community is concerned, and especially in key communities, states where the community has a strong concentration, it could have well been an Indian election in these pockets where the Indian American community and the voters are strong. So this is a new factor in these elections, and such a focus on India and on the Indian American community has really not been there before in any other US election.
On this, Tarun, I want to just add a couple of points, if I may. One is, of course, in lighter vein, which is that if you remember in the run-up to the election, the Republican campaign had one of their campaigners encouraging the Indian voter to vote for Mr. Donald Trump. And this lady tried to use a Hindi word. And she said that Mr. Trump, the president, is as wise as an owl. And in Hindustani, you call it Ullu. Now, I'm not quite sure whether she had understood the nuance of the word Ullu, but anyway, that is in lighter vein. But I thought the other significant element of the election is the fact that the Democrats have fielded Senator Kamala Harris. And the fact that she is of Indian origin, though within the United States, she is seen as an African American because of her father. But it's an interesting dimension again that for the first time, you have what they have in the past referred to when Mr. Obama was a presidential candidate. He was called as the first man of color. In that sense, I think for the historical record, Senator Kamala Harris would be the first woman of color to be on the vice presidential ticket as far as the US elections are concerned. And that again has its own, I think, resonance. But let me reel back to two of the points that I was trying to develop. That in this election, again, as I see it, one of the issues is the relationship between Washington, Beijing, and the other is Washington, Moscow. Now, both of them have a very interesting, I would say, historical relevance as far as the US is concerned. And we are aware that in Mr. Trump's presidency, the last 4 years, he has brought the latent US-China tension to the fore. And at the moment, we can see that there is a very intense trade war that is going on, apart from all the other allegations, aspersions going back to COVID-19, which Mr. Trump insists on calling as the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, as also issues like Taiwan, South China Sea, and the way in which the Trump administration has indicated its support to India as far as the line of actual control is concerned and the tension with China that India now has. So I think the broad inference or the analytical point that one could perhaps illuminate or point to is that the way in which the US-China relationship is going to unfold from January 21 onwards. If you have a Trump second term, surely there would be, I think, a greater tension in the way in which Mr. Trump is going to deal with China in the public domain. And the second is the bearing this would have as far as the India-China relationship is concerned and the US-India. So there is a triangle which is forming there, which is US, India, and China. But I think this is going to be also impacted by the nature of the Washington-Moscow relationship. Because we are aware that even in the first term of Mr. Trump, there was always this talk about the Russia factor. Did President Putin, have a role to play in quote unquote influencing the US election? So I thought these are two other issues that would be relevant as far as this election is concerned. But maybe, Tarun, you want to share some thoughts about the US and the other allies. For instance, Europe, what is likely to happen there? And also when we look at countries like Australia and Japan, how they would perhaps respond to the outcome of this election. Tarun?
Uday, when I was talking about the Indo-US relationship and quoted a senior US official for saying that India relationship is a constant, he also talked about that the Indo-US relationship is bigger than any political party, which I thought was a very, very significant statement to make just a week or 10 days before the election. Now, my question to you, is, that can that the same thing be said, or would any US officials say the same thing about a relationship with China or Russia or even the Europe? After all, this election is more an election of ideology and two radically different ideologies. While Trump represents a conservative, right-wing, protectionist ideology, Biden is a more moderate, liberal, inclusive ideology. So, if you look at it from the ideological perspective, of course, Biden would go for a closer ties with Europe. He'll try and, of course, rebuild that alliance or repair the damage which the Democrats think has been done to the US-Europe alliance. As far as ties with China and Russia are concerned, if you remember, Trump started off very famously saying that he would work closely with both Putin well as President Xi. And in fact, he went so far as to say when he was, I think, in Helsinki with President Putin, that he disbelieved his own intelligence officials and he was ready to work with President Putin. but things turned out very, very differently, and large measure due to domestic politics of the US. And same happened with China. So I think both the US and the Russia and the US China and the US Europe relationship would see significant changes in tune with the democratic ideology and their worldview.
Let me pick up this democracy bit and maybe we can close on this. Even as we speak, the Malabar exercise is currently underway in the Indian Ocean, where we have now 4 countries, the 4 Quad countries participating. Interestingly, Germany from the European Union has indicated its own willingness to be part of this. So all I'm trying to point to is to say that at the moment, there is a churn going on. An ideological churn is going on, I think, in the domestic politics of most major democracies. And India is part of this churn. We are going through our own internal process. But for instance, France and what has happened in France recently, or the assertion of the right wing in terms of the politics of Europe, I think all these are indicative of the kind of world we are likely to see in 2021 onwards, which will be, I think, strongly shaped and influenced by how the COVID-19 is also going to either taper off or will it become a more serious challenge, because the economic and trade costs that are being paid are very heavy. I don't think we have a clear idea as to how the global economy is going to cope with the fallout of COVID-19. And again, I think it's at one level sad that the United States and India are in the first and second position respectively when we talk about how COVID has affected their own people. But on that note, maybe we should, wait for the first phase of the election to conclude in the United States to get a sense. But as always, Tarun, thanks. I think we've covered some ground, not everything. And maybe we will revisit this particular subject in the course of the next 2 or 3 days.
Uday, I just want to add here, and because the latest reports from the US this morning are pretty ominous. People are fearing violence there. And in New York, major stores like Bloomingdale's are boarding up their storefronts with plywood because they think violence will break out. And there have been reports of Trump supporters trailing the Biden bus and trying to push him off the road. So these are pretty ominous signs, and people are worried that, first of all, the election results may be delayed. It might be a very contested election and maybe result even in social conflict. And who knows, the results, the worst case scenario, of course, may not be out even for days, if not weeks, if things go up to the courts. And here I would like to point out one thing, that even as US is talking about a contested election and conflicts and all that, despite all the churnings and all the conflicts and all the volatility of Indian democracy, the transition of power in India, right from the first election in 52 to the recent one in 2014, have been very, very smooth. And once the results are out, and the election results are out in matter of hours in such a big country with 800 million voters, there's complete acceptance of the result. And nobody goes to the courts and nobody goes out on the streets. And there's been a complete peaceful transition of power. So this is a kind of a little contrast, I think, between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy, which I think is, we should take note of.
No, absolutely. I think it's a very important observation that, in many ways, I think this points to the resilience of Indian democracy, which is relatively younger when we compare it with the United States. But I think you're absolutely right about drawing attention to this, because over the last couple of days, one has been talking to friends and family in the United States, and there is growing dismay that this election is actually going to test not only the integrity of the American democratic system and the institutions, but also the character of its people. And I think that is, as you said, a very ominous kind of a sign about what is at stake. But Tarun, thanks, and thank you for watching SAM Conversations. We hope to come back to the subject in the course of the next few days more than once. Thank you.
Thank you.